Hello everyone and welcome to the next review. So I've not been doing reviews recently, taking a bit of a break, but I thought I'd start off slowly with a book that I read a fair while ago now, maybe a few months ago or so, To See Clearly Why Ruskin Matters by Suzanne Cooper. What can we learn from John Ruskin? In our age of immediacy, the visionary Victorian artist and critic inspires us to look and linger. Fierce and encouraging, Ruskin's writings transform our sense of connection to the built environment and the natural world. Ruskin imagines new ways for the hand, head, and heart to work together. He teaches us that buildings tell stories, how to travel with more care, the need to respond to our own mental fragility and to the anxieties of others. Ruskin tells us how to work more effectively and more fairly. Above all, he challenges us to keep learning, in small ways and in great. I'd always been aware of John Ruskin through various avenues. I've kind of dipped into his primary text a little bit, such as Modern Painters and Unto This Last and Stones of Venice and things like this, just kind of dipped into them. But it's through the work of Patrick Curry that I became more aware of John Ruskin in a broader sense, especially through his work, Art and Enchantment, which deals with Ruskin a fair bit. And so I thought I would, before getting into more of the primary texts, read this overview, which is quite a nice overview. I quite like this. It's very thematically themed and based. It's very short and clear to the point. It's set up into different chapters such as seeing, drawing, building, travelling, and so forth. It's really quite a neat book. Now, of course, the book does an excellent job, I think, of explaining the life and work of Ruskin. But I'll just read a quick summary for those that are not aware. Just it's the best way to, I guess, present this information. From the Guild of St. George. The Guild of St. George was an organisation, charitable organisation that Ruskin set up. This is their website. It's still running, the organisation. They say that John Ruskin was a polymath. As a writer, he commanded international respect. He was an art critic and an art patron, a skilled draftsman and talented watercolourist, and a fierce critic of prevailing social and political norms. He wrote about nature and architecture, craftsmanship, geology, botany, Greek myth, education, a dizzying variety of subjects. And it's interesting that litany of, or that barrage of interests and fields that he took part in. When I was reading this book originally several months ago, and just as I was looking back at this book for the review, I remembered an image from John Howe, rather fittingly John Howe and John Ruskin, but the artist John Howe, the Tolkien artist John Howe, he wrote and illustrated a book called Cathedral, and in that book there's a particular painting that I love of a boy climbing up into the spires of a medieval cathedral and kind of exploring this secret world of carvings and intricate detail and all the animal grotesquerie and so forth. It's just a lovely image, and it reminded me of John Ruskin, this figure who is deeply embedded in the local, in the places he wants to embed himself in the places, I should say, in which he's travelling. Ruskin travelled a lot. He studied at Oxford, and he went to he spent some time in the Scottish Highlands as a younger man, or even as a boy rather. He went to Venice, France, all over the place, Switzerland I believe as well. He was very travelled. He was quite privileged. I believe his father was a wealthy wine merchant, and he essentially had a lot of time on his hands to write and cajole around the countryside and so forth. But and he knew this as well. He felt guilty about this as well. But all that aside, he's the type of person that really wants to embed himself in wherever he goes, and the places he visits, the beautiful and storied things that he finds himself encountering, meeting. And so where to begin then? Well, I will say I'm going to give a broader overview of Ruskin and what I kind of took away from this book and from his life. I can't quite remember all the details about his life and work, but of course I read this book quite a while ago. but I'm going to just highlight, to give you an idea of who Ruskin was, some of the passages that I've underlined, and I've written a lot of notes, and indeed, I do wish that I'd reviewed this at the time, after I'd finished reading it. But we'll start on chapter 1, Seeing. Free-heartedness and graciousness, and undisturbed trust and requited love, and the sight of the peace of others, and the ministry to their pain, these and the blue sky above you, and the sweet waters and flowers of the earth beneath, and mysteries and presences innumerable of living things, these may yet be your riches. And Suzanne says, Ruskin's care for his reader overspills the page as he calls down blessings like an ancient prophet or seer. He conjures up delights, sensual and intellectual, full of colour and movement. He encourages us to believe, with him, in a brighter world. And the very next subsection is called The View from South London. And it's John Ruskin looking out of his study window across the suburbs of London. I love that passage juxtaposed with the image of the window. Something that connects a lot of the people that I admire, people like Dunsany and so forth. And of course the symbolism of the window and what that represents. It's a fantastic opening to a book, I'll say that. He, John Ruskin, observed the clouds and the direction of the wind. The outer world was just as important to him as the inner workings of his mind, and so when he pronounced the glorious benediction on his readers, he imagined the wonders, seen and unseen, that he desired for them, as well as for himself. So John Ruskin was a man who knew intimately that everything is connected. The main message of this book, and I think of John Ruskin wanted to get across, is that everything is connected. Art and society, how we build, the stories we tell ourselves, observing the patterns of the weather intimately in with great detail, can tell us about how the world is shifting. John Ruskin was a man who, again, deeply put himself into observing phenomena, natural phenomena, cultural phenomena. He reminds me somewhat of Goethe. I remember reading about Goethe in Gary Lachman's book, The Lost Knowledge of the Imagination, his phenomenology, where he lets himself go in the observational act, but he lets the thing speak for itself as well. Tries not to objectify it and so forth. Hopefully I'm putting that in the correct way. John Ruskin was someone that really he let nature speak, and he absorbed, I think, all of these details. And there's an interesting passage here where Ruskin is talking about how taste is the only morality. Tell me what you like and I'll tell you what you are. And Suzanne says, he urged him to look for loveliness, and this is Ruskin, a simple love of that which deserves love. Suzanne again, he tried to explain that, and this is Ruskin, this is not an indifferent nor optional thing whether we love this or that, but it is just a vital function of all our being. Reminds me somewhat of Roger Scruton, where he says something to the effect of, beauty speaks to us not of what we want, but what we ought to want. I'm just going to read this passage without any context. It stands for itself. It's the type of person that Ruskin was. My entire delight was in observing without being myself noticed. If I could have been invisible, all the better. I was absolutely interested in men and their ways, as I was interested in marmots and chamois, and tomtits and trout. If only they would stay still and let me look at them and not get into their holes and up their heights. The living inhabitation of the world, the grazing and nesting in it, the spiritual power of the air, the rocks, the waters, to be in the midst of it and rejoice and wonder at it, and help it if I could, happier if it needed no help of mine. This was the essential love of nature in me, this the root of all that I have usefully become, and the light of all that I have rightly learned. I think those lines at the end there are some of the most powerful I've ever read. The way he phrases that is absolutely astounding. Ruskin had a love of the small and the local and the particular, the changeable, the ephemeral, everything that is reflects nature. And Suzanne writes, he taught us that it is worthwhile and uplifting and right to look for the well-formed, the kindly weathered, the small and unexpected visual treats that are right there. He's a quintessential humane humanist in the best sense of the word. Suzanne writes, he is the master of interdisciplinarity, a man whose mind could dart about from now to then, from here to there, from text to image to building to rock formation, with marvellous felicity. I love the way that that Suzanne describes him. You get the real sense of how he wants to absorb and say. It's the saving perception to me. I wrote about the saving perception. Michel Serres' the concept of the saving perception. We must look outward and cultivate a sense of gratitude for what we have, the gifts of the past. Ruskin seems to embody that more than anyone else, I think. Suzanne writes, he could cross boundaries and voice his opinions, at first on art, but then increasingly he spoke about the Alps, pollution, economics, war, railways, women's education, the good and ill he saw in the world. He can still teach us about the interconnectedness of people and things and places if only we know how to look. This is the essence of Ruskin, his ability to make connections and to show us why they matter. There's a particular scene that I love from the book where Suzanne is talking about Ruskin's childhood in Scotland, and of all places, his enclosed garden near the Loch Tay. I'll just read this section here. We have already seen that this desire to look closely at the workings of nature began early, as a toddler in his enclosed garden. His Scottish aunt also, and this is Ruskin, had a garden full of gooseberry bushes, this is Suzanne, but hers sloped down, and Ruskin again, down to the Tay, with a door opening to the water, which ran past it clear brown over the pebbles, 3 or 4 feet deep, an infinite thing for a child to look down into. This is Suzanne now. The constant swift motion, the tumbling stones, above all the sense of freedom from the constraint of his South London upbringing, combined to make this long-looking a greater delight, and he takes us with him, so that we can almost taste the sharpness of the gooseberries and feel the lap of the water at our fingertips. Ruskin shows us what is important about this scene. He brings into focus the small boy, squatting on the steps, alive to the small enchantments of a quiet scene. He saw it at the time. He could recreate it in his mind's eye nearly 50 years later, and he can bring it back for us with all its immediacy and joy. There's a lot in that passage, the dynamics of enchantment, and especially the image of the small boy leaning over the waters, looking into them. It reminds me of the story by Dunsany, how one came as was foretold to the city of Never, the small boy with his little red watering can, looking out over the Surrey hills. There's a lot in this book that I make connections with, and it's for me, I read this very quickly because it just has so much that I feel connected to and emotional about. So moving on to chapter 2, drawing, just want to point out that Ruskin really had a love of the dynamics of enchantment in relation to the creation of art, not just in the observation of nature. He says, I would rather teach drawing that my pupils may learn to love nature than to teach the looking at nature that they may learn to draw. And this is Suzanne speaking for Ruskin here about his lessons that he would give to his students. The early lessons help us to work with our materials, to create soft, accurate lines for pens and quiet, even tints with our watercolours. Avoid the flourish and the slapdash. The best work is always controlled. At twilight, look carefully at the shades of grey or purple or blue in the darkening sky. And, this is Ruskin, try to gradate a little space of white paper as evenly as that is gradated, as tenderly. This is Suzanne. He often asks us to work tenderly and delicately. Ruskin encourages us to treat our subjects with love as if they feel the strokes of a brush. And if you get tired and impatient, look up, look again at the sky, and see the beauty there. That is why we bother. This book is hard to read. That reminds me very much of as the antithesis of the modernist, capital M modernist, people like Picasso and so forth, who wanted to dominate nature, and the artists who have a programmatic approach to art of abstraction and irrationality and so forth. All the different ways that an artist can be a capital M modernist. But Ruskin is concerned with enchantment. He wants to love his subject through art and not control it, but let it speak for itself. This passage here about drawing is particularly moving. Ruskin did not always find drawing easy himself. He also had to make the effort to concentrate. One of the most revealing passages in his autobiography shows the effectiveness of drawing in giving us back the power to appreciate the obvious. Take a tree beside a path on a hot afternoon. Ruskin came across it when he was on a holiday. He had been underwhelmed by the sights of Fontainebleau and was tired and cross. He had developed a savage dislike of palaces and straight gravel walks. So he stopped, sat down and closed his eyes, but couldn't rest. There was a small aspen tree alone against the blue sky. He pulled paper and pencil from a pocket out of habit. This is Ruskin now. Languidly but not idly I began to draw it. And as I drew, the languor passed away. The beautiful lines insisted on being traced without weariness. More and more beautiful they became, as each rose out of the rest and took its place in the air. With wonder increasing every instant, I saw that they composed themselves by finer laws than any known of men. At last, the tree was there, and everything that I had thought before about trees nowhere. This is Suzanne now. Ruskin discovered that the act of drawing was transformative. It restored his curiosity and his sense of place and possibilities. He never forgot that tree or how it made him feel. He realised that, and this is Ruskin, that all the trees of the wood, for I saw surely that my little aspen was only one of their millions, should be beautiful. And this is Suzanne, more beautiful than Gothic tracery or embroidery or a magnificent painting. It gave him, as he remembered, this is Ruskin, an insight into a new sylvan world. So Ruskin wasn't just drawing for his own pleasure, he also, again, took many observations. And over time, there's a whole section of this book where it details Ruskin's observations of changing natural phenomena, weather, climate patterns. And he begins to notice storm cloud. He calls a plague wind, and this is a fantastic sentence here. Ruskin simply says in his notes, blanched sun, blighted grass, blinded man. Because of industrial pollution, the skies were darkening, everything was becoming muddied and unclear. Ruskin was one of the very first people to document climate change, essentially. And this is Suzanne speaking. Ruskin also knew that darkening skies overhead had an impact on our own inner vision. We lose sight of the thing that lifts our spirits and we feel bereft. He experienced prolonged and devastating depression and mental instability beginning in the mid-1870s. It was triggered by grief at the death of his parents and Rose, his partner, but it was also directly connected with fears about the storm cloud and hellish wind. He noted in his diary for the 11th of February 1881, some dim blue sky with scuddling cloud but getting darker, and I am utterly horror-struck and hopeless about the weather. The plague wind now constant, and the sun virtually extinguished. This is Suzanne. 10 days later he was dreadfully ill again, with, and this is Ruskin, a breakdown of the brain. This is Suzanne. He could not draw, his words dried up. He smashed the glass in his bedroom window. He had seen it coming, but could not avert the storm. That particular passage reminds me of some lyrics by Peter Bjorgel. Just as the world disintegrates, so does my mind. Nature falls to our abuse, just like me inside. Now, there really is so much to talk about in this book. I've only just reached the architecture chapter. Suffice it to say, Ruskin was a lover of architecture, of buildings and their history. He wanted to preserve. He he lamented the destruction, the outright destruction of these ancient buildings, but also how they were being restored as well. Suzanne writes, sitting in a cafe in Picardy, Ruskin wrote to his father, I have been doing my best to draw the cathedral porch, but alas, it is not so easily done. I seem born to conceive what I cannot execute, and mourn over what I cannot save. He was watching the medieval cathedrals, this is Suzanne, and houses disappearing before his eyes. This is Ruskin again. In 20 years it is plain that not a vestige of Abbeville, or indeed of any old French town, will be left. This is Suzanne. I visited Abbeville in May this year. He was right. Ruskin has been outraged by the vandalism of restoration in the 1840s. When he was there, workmen were, this is Ruskin, knocking down the time-worn black with age pinnacles and sticking up in their place new stone ones to be carved at some future time. This is Suzanne. Blank blocks were replacing the intricate crockets around the door frames. Ruskin felt so desperate that he threatened to knock the men off their scaffolding. What would he have said now about the stump of the cathedral and the graceless shopping precinct built in its shadow? How could he have borne the devastation of this medieval masterpiece in the bombardment of 1940? Time, restoration, war, and soulless reconstruction have undone the flamboyant Gothic that Ruskin sat and studied. At least we have his words and pictures to show us how glorious it used to be. Again, Ruskin is so deeply attached to the things that he loves that he almost ascends the scaffolding and physically removes the workers. Again, I love this passage here. Ruskin's efforts of concentrated looking and the records he made enabled him to reconstruct the history of buildings in Britain and across Europe. When he was travelling, he would set out straight after breakfast with his notebooks and tape measures and sketch old houses and churches for 6 hours a day. He drew their details, adding notes in the margin. He copied the colours of their marbles and mosaics with his paints. He set up tripods and captured their light and shade, the ivy clinging to their surfaces, with daguerreotype photography. He organised teams to create plaster casts of the most delicate carved capitals and traceries. He climbed ladders, stuck his head out of windows, cajoled, protested and preserved. He loved buildings. That really speaks for itself. There really is so much in this book about Ruskin's opinions on architecture and the Gothic and so forth, and his disagreements and the setting up of the Guild of St. George and all the work that he did and all his treaties and so forth. But again, there's only so much time, and this review is long enough as it is, but I'll just try and give a summary of what he felt here in this passage. All lovely architecture was designed for cities in cloudless air, for cities built that men might live happily in them, and take delight daily in each other's presence and powers. But there were cities built in black air, which, by its accumulated fullness, first renders all ornament invisible in distance, and then chokes its interstices with soot. Cities in which the object of men is not life, but labour, and in which the streets are not the avenues for the passing and procession of a happy people, but the drains for the discharge of a tormented mob. In which the only object in reaching any spot is to be transferred to another. In which existence becomes mere transition, and every creature is only one atom in a drift of human dust and current of interchanging particles, circulating here by tunnels underground, and there by tubes in the air. For a city or cities such as this, no architecture is possible. Nay, no desire of it is possible to their inhabitants. That really captures so much of the problem with our built environment today. I would suggest he had a way of putting things, didn't he? No pretentious language, it really gets to the heart of things. And yes, as I say, there's just a lot to cover. This book goes into Ruskin's love life, his relationships, the turmoil of his relationships with other art critics, and the disputes he had. So yes, there's a lot that I've not covered here. There's also Ruskin's difficulty with his religion. He was a Christian. He constantly had doubts. But I will just end by reading this section here. I think it gives you an idea of who Ruskin was and what he truly felt. The kind of actions that he inspired. Wealth and Ill. Ruskin refused to subscribe to the redistribution of wealth advocated by the socialists, and he always maintained his faith in monarchy and hierarchies, the proper places of masters and men. But he did attempt to transform her concept of wealth. He asked, why does our society hold precious and beneficent things such as air, light and cleanliness to be valueless? That was Ruskin speaking. He recognized that our environment is supremely important. He knew that air and light cannot be taken for granted. The storm clouds were already gathering. Ruskin saw that our ways of working are to blame and are unsustainable. Says Ruskin, men can neither drink steam nor eat stone, he wrote. If no one speaks out, we are destined to, this is Ruskin, live diminished lives in the midst of noise, of darkness, and of deadly exhalation. His approach was anti-capitalist. He questioned what it means to be rich. This is Ruskin. Some treasures, as he put it, are heavy with human tears. This is Suzanne again. The money in our pocket is not intrinsically valuable. It is only worth something if we have it, and our neighbours do not. Ruskin returned to his evangelical roots, creating allegories that remind us of Bible stories. Suppose there was a person, and this is Ruskin, in possession of a large estate of fruitful land, with rich beds of gold in its gravel, countless herds of cattle in its pastures. But suppose, after all, that he could get no servants. In order that he may be able to have servants, someone in his neighbourhood must be poor, and in want of his gold or his corn. Assume that no one is in want of either. He must therefore bake his own bread, make his own clothes, plough his own ground, and shepherd his own flocks. His gold will be as useful to him as any other yellow pebbles on his estate. His stores must rot, for he cannot consume them. He can eat no more than another man could eat, and wear no more than another man could wear. The message in Ruskin's parable is clear. This is Ruskin speaking. What is really desired under the name of riches is essentially power over men. This is Suzanne speaking. In our culture, being rich means buying and selling another person's labour. It is built on inequality. But it is possible to sidestep this system. This is Ruskin speaking now. To seek not greater wealth but simpler pleasure, not higher fortune but deeper felicity. This is Suzanne. Ruskin associates these pleasures with fruitfulness, with diverse habitats, with birdsong. Ruskin speaking. No air is sweet that is silent. And this is Suzanne speaking. Of course, his vision is idealistic, based on a utopian pre-industrial model, but it is also compelling. Ruskin's readers have always found ways to push back against encroaching elf, the word he coined for work that is negative, that causes, in Ruskin's words here, devastation and trouble. Often, this is through small adjustments. They have set up a book group, planted window boxes or allotments, joined local wildlife projects, cleaned a canal, moved to Ruskin Land. Ruskin Land being a place that Ruskin set up. It's essentially a nature reserve and a place of cultural heritage. Built a garden city, campaigned for the National Health Service. None of these are income generating in the usual sense, but they are life enhancing. And, as Ruskin said, there is no wealth but life. Thanks for watching, everyone. Until next time.